Having escaped the lion's den, Mr. Lehrmann made the mistake of coming back for his hat. So said Justice Michael Lee in Mr. Lehrmann's lawsuit against Network 10 and against Lisa Wilkinson. Bruce Lehrmann lost the litigation, and it's evidence to us of why people need to be incredibly careful when suing over defamation, or more pointedly, why people should be very careful about the conduct they're engaging in. Now, I'm going to be very careful in this video because I don't want to allege criminal misconduct, for the obvious reason that Bruce Lehrmann appears to be rather litigious. So I'm going to try to be as circumspect as possible when saying all of these things. However, Mr. Lehrmann lost his case against Network 10 and against Lisa Wilkinson. He has not been vindicated by this case, and it would have been better for him to not pursue the litigation. Now, there were some interesting findings in Justice Michael Lee's judgment or his reading thereof, and it's worth going through some of these because they're slightly telling about Bruce Lehrmann, but also more generally about the conduct of the parliamentarians and the other politicians. So focusing on Bruce Lehrmann, well, Bruce Lehrmann clearly lost this case. Here, he was the primary party, i.e. he was the plaintiff suing Network 10 and Lisa Wilkinson. Notably, Linda Reynolds has a separate litigation ongoing against Brittany Higgins. That's something that I'll address a little bit later on. That's ongoing litigation, and I don't want to prejudge it. But focusing on Bruce Lehrmann, the judge said, Mr. Lehrmann is not entitled to the vindication of his reputation. He also stated that on the balance of probabilities, Bruce Lehrmann raped Brittany Higgins. Now, whether or not he would be found guilty at a new criminal trial is a separate matter, because the standard of proof at the criminal trial is very different from at a civil trial. That is, at a criminal trial, the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused did the particular act. By contrast, at this civil trial, all that was needed to be proved was that Bruce Lehrmann raped Brittany Higgins on the balance of probabilities, a much easier standard, however still a notable standard nevertheless. The judge also stated that Mr. Lehrmann did not care whether or not Brittany Higgins was consenting during sex. He also stated, I'm satisfied that it is more likely than not Mr. Lehrmann's state of mind was such that he was so intent upon gratification to be indifferent to whether Ms. Higgins was consenting. He stated that Bruce Lehrmann was, quote, hell-bent on having sex with a woman he found sexually attractive, had been mutually passionately kissing and touching, and knew had reduced inhibition. He did not care one way or the other whether Ms. Higgins understood or consented to what was going on. Although I am not satisfied that there was a clear verbal protest, and find it more likely that Ms. Higgins was passive during the sexual act, any suggestion that some form of active resistance is determinative for the question of concern would be misguided. The suggestion that a woman is expected to either fight or flight to be accepted as having been a victim of sexual assault is not only not reasonably open, but is wrong-headed. In essence, this was a catastrophic ruling for Bruce Lehrmann. He lost the case and was found to be on the balance of probabilities to have raped Brittany Higgins. He therefore will not receive damages, and he might be up for Network 10's and for Lisa Wilkinson's costs. As a result, Bruce Lehrmann would have been better off never pursuing this litigation. If he had not pursued this litigation, he would have been able to reflect back and said, well, he was not found guilty at a criminal trial, and there were some accusations against Shane Drumgold, and the softening of inquiry occurred, and therefore he would cast doubt on the veracity of that prosecution and the trial associated with it. Bruce Lehrmann could have reasonably continued on with his life, especially since a lot of the media reporting had died down about that. However, now that he went through this litigation, it has backfired spectacularly on him, both from a reputational perspective and from a financial perspective. The second and interesting thing is about the conduct of parliamentarians. Now, the parliamentarians, so people like Linda Reynolds and the like, appear to have come off reasonably well from this whole saga, at least from this particular litigation. The reason I say that is Justice Michael Lee dismissed the idea of there being a political cover-up, or of the parliamentarians wanting to go out and suppress the information coming out, or to stop Brittany Higgins from reporting the whole incident. Indeed, it appears that most of the politicians wanted to go directly to the police, which to my mind would probably have been the most prudent thing to do. If, for example, there is a workplace and one of your employees might have been sexually assaulted, the most prudent thing is to just let the police decide whether or not there was an issue here. The police are the best equipped to resolve that whole situation. And if a corporation engages in an internal investigation, they could always be accused to have been biased. It could always be accused to be something of a cover-up, even if there is no evidence of that necessarily occurring. It appears that Justice Michael Lee suggested that there was no real evidence of a cover-up, and the accusations of there being a cover-up or of misconduct appeared not to be made out, at least on the evidence adduced at court. Now, to be very clear, maybe Brittany Higgins will adduce additional evidence, because that wasn't really that much of a matter and issue right here. So it could be that at a separate proceeding, additional evidence is forthcoming, and perhaps there are adverse findings against people like Linda Reynolds. But right now, it doesn't appear that that would be likely. Now, to be clear, I don't want to prejudge the litigation and the saga ongoing between, for example, Linda Reynolds and Brittany Higgins, because that, of course, is still ongoing, and we need to wait for that to resolve. However, it's notable that there's at least an arguable case in relation to that. The third thing was in relation to Brittany Higgins and her credit. Now, the judge here stated that Brittany Higgins was maybe not the best witness. There were some unreliabilities in relation to the testimony she gave. However, in the operative areas that were pointed to this trial, he found that she was generally a bit more credible, and in the specific areas that were really under question, i.e. whether there was sexual assault, he generally found her to be credible, and he found that her behaviour was consistent with that of a victim of sexual assault. Now, again, to be clear, we can't make any findings about a criminal misconduct here, because this was not a criminal trial, and I want to be very careful of not prejudging anyone of any criminal wrongdoing. However, like I've indicated, he found that Brittany Higgins, to some extent, was self-serving in some ways, particularly in relation to the post-incident conduct. However, in relation to the incident itself, he found that on the balance of probabilities did occur. For example, he seemed to suggest that the allegations of there being a cover-up weren't really very well supported. He seemed to suggest that a lot of her evidence, or at least a lot of her statements to the media, were vague and were to some extent self-interested. He seemed to find that her biography, or the draft thereof, was not necessarily very accurate, as is the nature of such texts. They oftentimes are designed to paint the subject in a better light than would otherwise be the case. For example, it's often stated that a biography doesn't reveal anything negative about its author, except for their memory, as Justice Michael Lee stated. However, in general, to a lot of the core allegations, he appeared to find that she was credible enough, even if she was not necessarily credible in other areas. Or phrased differently, someone can be credible about one particular thing, especially when it is cross-validated by other statements, but not necessarily credible about everything that they say is more to the point. So overall, therefore, Bruce Lehrmann has lost. He probably should never have pursued this litigation. It's created a bit of a Streisand effect, so to speak, i.e. it's brought more attention to the conduct than would otherwise have been the case. And also it has backfired spectacularly, because he could have walked away from this, but now he is found to have sexually assaulted Brittany Higgins on a balance of probabilities. His reputation, therefore, will be besmirched by this. Now, of course, Bruce Lehrmann may attempt to appeal this judgment. Whether or not an appeal is successful is something that would remain to be seen. But it appears that many people have come off very negatively from this scandal. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below, but be respectful about what you're saying.